The NATO aircraft did not slip quietly through the sky. It was never meant to. It moved with deliberate steadiness at medium altitude, sensors alive, antennas listening, data flowing in clean, uninterrupted streams. Its transponder broadcast openly, its route filed, lawful, and fully compliant with international aviation law. This was not stealth. There was no deception here. This was a presence patrol. And presence, especially in contested skies, had a way of provoking attention. The aircraft's gray silhouette cut through the pale northern sky, a reminder written in aluminum and radar returns. We are here, and we are allowed to be. Hundreds of kilometers away, Russian air defense radar systems came alive with certainty. The contact appeared instantly. Large radar return, distinctive NATO signature, steady heading, no deviation. Inside a Russian air defense command center, the ambient hum of electronics filled the room. Screens glowed, tracks stabilized. An officer leaned forward, eyes narrowing. NATO ISR aircraft, track confirmed. There was no debate, no hesitation. The order moved through the room like a reflex. Scramble interceptors. On a Russian airbase, 2 interceptors thundered down the runway. Engines screamed as afterburners ignited, pressing the pilots back into their seats. The aircraft clawed upward into the cold, thin air, banking toward the contact. The mission briefing was simple, deceptively so. Intercept, identify. Detour, nothing more. Nothing less. Yet every pilot knew how thin the line was between intercept and incident. Inside the NATO aircraft, warning tones chimed softly. Not alarms, not yet, just information. New contacts, fast movers, closing rapidly. The aircraft commander didn't flinch. Russian fighters inbound, maintain course, record everything. This was not the first intercept. These encounters were familiar, almost routine. But something about the closure rate, the speed, the geometry, it felt sharper, tighter, less ceremonial. The first Russian interceptor slid into view, rising from below and to the side. Sleek, angular, purpose-built for intimidation. Close enough for the NATO crew to make out details. Close enough to see the pilot's helmet. Too close. Moments later, the second Russian jet positioned itself below and behind the NATO aircraft, offset just enough to complete the picture. They were being boxed in. A textbook maneuver, one designed not to attack, but to dominate. The Russian lead fighter edged even closer, reducing separation beyond accepted safety margins. Inside the NATO cockpit, a sensor operator muttered quietly, almost involuntarily. He's inside minimum separation. Cameras rolled, sensors tracked. Every meter, every angle, every aggressive nudge was captured and time-stamped. This was no longer routine shadowing. This was pressure. The NATO aircraft transmitted calmly, professionally. Russian military aircraft. You are operating in international airspace. Maintain safe distance. There was no reply. The Russian fighters remained silent. Intentionally so. Silence in this context was not absence. It was a message. Without warning, the Russian lead interceptor surged forward, crossing directly in front of the NATO aircraft's nose before pulling sharply upward. The maneuver sent violent wake turbulence rolling back across the NATO jet's wings. Alarms chirped, the aircraft rocked. Inside Russian command, the action was noted with clinical detachment, pilot asserting dominance. Inside NATO command, the assessment was colder. This is unsafe. Then something subtle, but critical, shifted. NATO sensors detected a change in the Russian fighter systems. No lock, no launch, but unmistakably, weapons armed. The distinction mattered. It always did. Then it happened. The Russian interceptor rolled slightly, dipped its nose, and fired. Short bursts. Tracer rounds tore through empty air well ahead of the NATO aircraft. They didn't strike. They weren't intended to. But there was no ambiguity. This was live fire. Inside the NATO aircraft, alarms erupted. Not missile warnings, but gunfire proximity alerts. The aircraft commander clenched his jaw. They fired. Record timestamp. This crossed a line. At NATO Air Command, the room fell silent. Weapons discharge. Confirmed. Live fire. Warning shots? Confirmed. A pause followed. Brief, heavy. Escalation protocols in effect. At a nearby NATO airbase, pilots already on alert broke into motion. Helmets snapped on, engines spun up, runways cleared. This was no longer observation. The Russian Interceptor tightened its turn, sliding closer still. The second fighter shifted into a more aggressive escort position. They were not disengaging. They were doubling down. Every instinct screamed to turn away, but turning now would signal retreat, and retreat could invite pursuit. The NATO aircraft held steady. Hands hovered near emergency switches. Both Russian pilots saw it at the same time. New contacts, fast, high, approaching from the west, NATO fighters. Inside Russian command, the update snapped across consoles. NATO fighters airborne, multiple. The response came instantly. Maintain intercept. Do not disengage. 4 combat aircraft converged into a shrinking volume of airspace. 2 Russian interceptors, 1 NATO patrol aircraft, 2 NATO fighters closing fast. There was no room for error, no room for bravado. As the NATO fighters closed to visual range, the Russian lead interceptor received a new directive: authorize escalation phase. At the same moment, inside a NATO fighter cockpit, a tone sounded, a sound no pilot ever wanted to hear. Radar warning spike. Weapons were no longer just armed. They were being aimed. The first NATO fighter burst through a thin cloud layer at high speed, its silhouette sharp against the pale northern sky. Seconds later, the second fighter slid into position slightly above and behind the NATO patrol aircraft. This was no accident. This was protection. NATO aircraft. This is Guardian 1. We are on your wing. Inside the patrol aircraft, the crew exhaled. Just a fraction. They were no longer alone. The Russian lead interceptor adjusted immediately, climbing to match altitude. The second jet drifted outward, widening the formation. 4 fighters now shared dangerously close air. Every movement was deliberate. Every meter mattered. A sharp tone pulsed again inside the NATO fighter cockpit. Radar illumination. Not a missile lock, but close enough to feel personal. Spike detected. Russian aircraft illuminating. His wingman confirmed the same. Both NATO fighters were now being painted. At NATO Air Command, decisions were made in seconds. Legal advisors and commanders moved in lockstep. Weapons fired, radar locks active. NATO aircraft threatened. The ruling was clear. Defensive postures authorized. No first fire. The message reached the pilots almost instantly. You are cleared to maneuver defensively. Do not escalate unless fired upon. The Russian lead interceptor suddenly rolled left and sliced between the NATO patrol aircraft and its escorting fighter. Meters, shockwaves slammed both cockpits. This was no longer signaling. This was provocation. Despite everything, the NATO pilots did not bite. No missiles armed, no counterlocks, no sudden turns. They matched speed, matched altitude, denied excuses. Far below, unseen by the pilots but glaringly visible to command centers, a NATO naval radar picked up the entire engagement. A destroyer in international waters adjusted its sensors upward. Data flowed. Sea, air, Command. Linked. Inside the Russian command center, the tone shifted. NATO fighters were holding firm. Naval assets were watching. Everything was recorded. An officer spoke carefully. This is becoming visible. Visibility meant consequences. For the first time, the Russian lead interceptor transmitted. Aircraft, alter course immediately. The NATO fighter pilot replied, and in the space between that transmission and the next decision, the sky held its breath.